Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers. With your host, Ben Siders, that's me, and the other guy is Kirk Damon. We are still dealing with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which, as of today, which is July 8th, 2020, continues to rage on in the United States. At any rate, Kirk is on vacation, and he has sent me an episode on Pokemon and kind of bleed over into universe copyright / branding. So I'm going to try to get a number of these edamame episodes out the door here. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and drop Kirk's content in here so you can enjoy that. I have not listened to it yet, so we will enjoy it together. Thanks, and here's Kirk.
Okay, I am jumping back on for another edamame episode. Yeah, as we say, they're not a full pod, partially because it's just me. I am outside again and recording this one. So again, background noise may happen. I've taken to recording these things outside, partially because of the fact that my house is kind of noisy, and I don't get a lot of space. It also allows me to escape from everybody and not have them find me immediately. It also allows them to not necessarily overhear what I'm talking about and people necessarily wanting to participate in conjunction with these. This may be the most important of those for the participation, and one of the things I want to talk about, and I think I touched briefly on this in a prior show, but I don't remember, is one of the things that I've been doing in conjunction with my family with this is I have gotten a very thorough introduction to Pokemon. So I think I talked about it previously. My son has been fairly into Pokemon. I mean, he has Pokemon bed sheets, he has Pokemon pajamas, a number of the toys, and has played the collectible card game. But one of the things for quarantine, we actually, and I have to credit my wife with this, she had the bright idea of going to the library before the library closed. We ran off with a large amount of books from the library. And one of the things that we got from it was we got both the CD sets for the Pokemon Indigo League, the very first, Pokemon animated series, and Pokemon Orange League, the one that follows immediately thereafter. Unfortunately, we've now made it all the way through the Indigo League collection. Unfortunately, it was not the entire CD set, or DVD set, which we didn't realize. We're missing the last 3 discs. So we've had lots of Ash journeying, but we've had none of him getting there in the final battles. So that was kind of unfortunate. We got no culmination from it. But it was still a good show. And now we're basically 1 disc through the Orange League, listening to it. Because of the fascination with this, we've also discovered the current Sun and Moon. I don't remember what it is. It's got a separate subcategory underneath it, something Beasts, is also currently out. And so we've also taken to watching that. What I think is so interesting about watching it, one, I've actually enjoyed the shows. Now, part of it's, I've been sort of interested in the mythology of Pokemon. I did play Pokemon Go. I know I've mentioned that on the show before. My son was into it. And so I've kind of interested in the mythology of it. But it's one of those things that has never really struck me. I never really got the true appeal of it. And I do think part of that is just because timing-wise, I'm obviously watching it as an adult. It was not something I grew up with, but it was something I knew was around, even when I was a little bit younger. But I could never understand necessarily why people were so into it. So when I used to go to Pokemon Go raids, I'd encounter plenty of people around there. It was fun. I enjoyed going to the raids. It was just sort of fun to meet up, with random people, at some point in time that you encounter on a somewhat regular basis related to raids. You could chit chat a bit, what did you caught, stuff like that. But I never had the extreme, desire to it. The one I really remember is the very first time they did I think they were called Ultra Raids, where you had to be invited. It was the only way at the time to get Mewtwo, which was the first release. I remember seeing, hey, we're going to go to this raid. It's going to be cool. I'd never done one of these. It was the first one I'd gotten invited to, and it was one of the first ones that they'd done. I mean, I'm only the first or second of the ones that they'd done that anybody around me had access to. And I remember going and doing the raid, this was fun, this was cool, great, I got this really powerful Pokemon, which at the time you couldn't do a lot with. Battles had not really come into play yet. It was mostly just gym battles, which I always found a bit, anticlimactic might be the best way to describe it. And this was the newer gyms when it started playing. And again, the time of when they did this. So it wasn't the old where you had the problem with the tanked up gyms you couldn't take. Now there was the decrease over time and the ability to take gyms that I think dramatically improved the game. But I remember when we caught Mewtwo, there were probably 60 people there. We'd separated into multiple different raid groups. And at the end of it, I'm like, hey, great. I caught this cool thing. That's neat. But there are people like running around hugging that, they're just so happy. And I remember kind of thinking, like, why? What is it about this that so strikes people as being important? Why is it, catching Mewtwo is so big? And even as I've gotten more involved in it, I've reached the point that I still don't entirely, understand it. We went inside Detective Pikachu, which I loved as a movie. I thought it was hugely fun. But it wasn't a movie that I saw, again, I didn't need to see, that this is what Pikachu would look like in live action animation as opposed to being, an animated character, being more sort of real world, things like that. So it was one of those where it really kind of struck me as just why is it that people have such an attachment to it? Well, now being able to see the Indigo League and seeing the Orange League, I really am starting to understand more of it, I think. And I look back at myself, and when I was a kid, the big animated cartoon series I watched was the Transformers and G.I. Joe. They came on one right after another. I was much more into Transformers, and actually the timing of when I got home from school, G.I. Joe, by the time I got off the school bus, had usually started, and so I often missed the beginning of it. But Transformers was after, and I'd see all of Transformers, and that was what I really wanted to watch. Those definitely struck me as being nostalgic and being as being something that at the time was very important. And even now I'm nostalgic for them and I enjoy them. But I never had that with Pokemon. But now I sort of treat it as Pokemon in some respects for some people is the same thing I had in conjunction with Transformers and G.I. Joe. And so I get a little more of the desire to it. At the same time, I've also recognized that I think there is a much more appeal to the collectability of Pokemon. And that wasn't obviously a core of the show. The idea of capturing these Pokemon, of having ones that are yours, of battling people who have other ones, and getting to see new ones in the introduction. And the sort of, as they get increasingly more powerful as they evolve, stuff along those lines. So anyway, it's a very interesting thing to me to sort of watch this. Like I said, I understand it more. I think that people have kind of a visceral thing to this. And what I want to tie this back into is associations we talked about previously with where do people have the visceral reaction to Star Wars and the changes to Star Wars. And I think that's the easiest way for me to understand it at this point in time is that's what I've had. That's my, version of where I have problems with it. I have problems with the changes. I have the visual, the sort of visceral reaction to it is, hey, I've got this, I've got that. Still not quite to the same extent. And again, I think part of it is just the nature of the collectability of the Pokemon, and that part of the story is collecting them, of, capturing them. This is a large challenge to capture and collect them. And, being able to do that now is a unique thing. We've also been playing much more of the collectible card game. My son's gotten the collectible card game. He has also now created his own version of Pokemon battles around the collectible card game, which doesn't require playing the card game and is much simpler. It's also something that I think he can near universally win, which is probably part of the reason that it appeals to him. Basically he wins because he always has more powerful Pokemon than everybody else does. It's been interesting sort of learning this thing, to learn all this stuff about Pokemon, and where it goes. And it's just been announced, people have probably seen this, Pokemon is now the most valuable brand in the world. It's something that I think everybody has touched on, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit when we got into the legal side of this, is not just in the idea of now starting to understand more about Pokemon, and seeing what it is, but starting to understand and starting to question the idea of what makes Pokemon a brand. Anybody who knows it, and I think if you haven't, you can get a pretty quick crash course, but I'll give you just a few basic overviews of things that struck me. So the vast majority of Pokemon, definitely you can catch stuff from a lot of their names that has something to do with a little bit of what they are. Pikachu's, I think, kind of the exception. Pikachu's kind of a unique thing. Obviously, it's sort of the star of the show, but a lot of the other ones don't. So the example of You know what I put out there, and I think as a good example is Squirtle. Squirtle is basically a turtle, and as he gets more and more powerful, he becomes Wartortle, and then becomes Blastoise. Obviously, the names are plays off of, the words turtle and tortoise. He's a turtle. He's a water type. He uses attacks as a turtle. He squirts water. So it's one of those where, I think you look at him and say he's not necessarily completely made up. He obviously has some connection to reality and to real things. But what makes him a Pokemon? And this comes from the fact that my son, as part of the collectible card game, has started making his own cards. Now, he's made his own game associated with it, but he does the same kind of thing. And it's one of those where he tends to do the same thing. He kind of finds things around and then kind of plays off of them as to what they would be. So, for example, he has, just becoming attracted to the body parts as he was looking for things to use. He has finger, which evolves into hand. So you've got a little bit of that idea of them being somewhat real things, somewhat things we relate to. You definitely see it in conjunction with the show. Growlithe is a dog, and basically takes the place of dogs in conjunction with it. You've got the Pokemon all sort of having their uses, their roles, stuff like that, particularly in conjunction with the show and where they come in. But they all tend to have some relationship to, in some sense, real things. So I think it's one of those where it's a very interesting thing that they're not completely made up. They obviously have some connections. And again, if you go through the books, I've been through my son's books in conjunction with it, a lot of them have connections to something. You can see sort of what it is. This one is a candle, and the candle evolves into a chandelier. And their names are similar to those. Now, there's obviously also completely made up ones. But they obviously have some connection. They also have, connections to elements, to sort of seem, classic elemental type arguments, things like that. So that then brought to me is, why is this the most valuable brand? What is it about them that's made them so unique? If you look at it and say, I can come up with, a pigeon looking creature and come up with a name like Pidgey, which is the pigeon Pokemon, and by far the most sort of common and one of the most well-known ones, in the universe. Why does this one brand have the huge value that it does? What does it mean to be able to say something's a Pokemon versus just being able to say it's a animated animal that, is a companion that sort of lives in its own world? What makes it that? And it's not something that you necessarily pin down. And it's what comes to me and doing that when talking about intellectual property. It ultimately does come down to a brand. The reason a Pokemon is valuable, the reason Pokemon is valuable as a brand, is because people want Pokemon. They don't want creatures that are, vaguely resembling things in the real world, but happen to be drawn in a Japanese anime style. They want Pokemon. And it's valuable because it's a Pokemon, and Pokemon's valuable because people want Pokemon. So it becomes almost a self-fulfilling cycle. And it's one of those things that I find very, very interesting in conjunction with branding and in trademarking. And it's something when I talk to people about, what does it mean to trademark? What does it mean to become a brand? I think a lot of people understand at sort of a core level. They understand the idea of, hey, I want to be a brand. I want to have things be my brand. I want them to be important. But they don't necessarily understand from a protection point of view of the idea that, if you really want to say, you're the sole one who gets to dictate what is a Pokemon, you have to be the Pokemon company. And that means you get to dictate what is and is not a Pokemon. It is, if it's not a Pokemon, it's just, Japanese anime style, thing loosely based upon an object which exists in our world, which has different kinds of powers and resistance a different kind of world. So anyway, that was the real take on this one, is just to talk a little bit about that and what does it mean to be branding. It's been a continuous theme for me and something that I've sort of always studied. I know we've done initially a very early on episode, and we've talked about revisiting again something that's fascinating me, which is the idea of what does it mean to be in universe, and sort of what is copyright in universe, what does it relate to? This is the idea of talking about, it's not necessarily sort of the copyright and the coverage of copyright in universe, but it literally now being that universe is a brand that, you've got something that says it is this thing because we say it is this thing. We don't necessarily have to put much of a story around it. I don't know if all the Pokemon that appear like in the, unabridged guide to Pokemon, or that appear in the card game or appeared in all the various games, exist in the animated series or exist elsewhere sort of in the universe. I assume they exist somewhere. That's where they've originally created. I don't know if there's any that exist solely as products, so to speak, that's, you can buy a stuff, plush version of one, but you can't necessarily see it anywhere, in any of the products that there may be. But that's the thing that I sort of wanted to get into with this is it's interesting to think about it from a copyright point of view and the idea of copyright and universe and protection of copyright and universe. And what does it mean to be in universe and to be canon? We now see it not just in the idea of copyright and not just in the idea of sort of being part of a storyline officially, but now being part of a brand, where you don't necessarily need to even be part of the story, to still be part of the brand. All the Pokemon in my son's encyclopedia of it have literally a 1-sentence description of what they are. Oftentimes, that description does not brought out, in conjunction with the show. It's not something that people necessarily talk about, in the animated show or in anything, that this is sort of what the 1-sentence item is. But I think it does tell you the idea of just how important it is to have things be interconnected. And that, now we have the world's most valuable brand being essentially an interconnection of things and a universe from those interconnection of things, which changes every time a new episode comes out. As we happen to be watching Sun and Moon, I have no idea what a Z move is. We have not encountered those in Orange League yet. Obviously, that's a new thing. From those, Z moves in Orange League. We didn't encounter sort of those things, those types of things in Indigo League. But in Sun and Moon, there's, all of a sudden new things, there's new discussions, as to what it is. And every one of these things seems to introduce whole new concepts. What does it sort of mean to continue those concepts? And it seems to be becoming increasingly common in conjunction with brands of this idea of things falling under the brand. I think the Lego Ninjago series, another good example, which starts off basically as sort of, traditional martial art movie style ninjas. I mean, I wouldn't say they're historical, but they're definitely sort of, fantasy versions of ninjas. Is where they all started, fighting, evil skeletons. It was a sort of standard plot line, and by the time the Ninjago movie comes out, the Ninjago movie's all about, mecha, constructs. The skeleton warriors have kind of gone, and they're still there, but, they've kind of gone by the wayside. And we're focused much more on sort of modern world, and influence in conjunction with, modern and even, science fiction era concepts. So anyway, I want to talk about that as the idea of branding, and that brands are becoming potentially increasingly valuable in the world. And what does it mean to, at this point in time, be part of a brand? So anyway, that's my talk on there. Obviously, it rambled a little bit. These edamame episodes, I think, have a habit of wandering a little bit, just because I have nobody to talk to. I'm sitting here talking to my phone, and not necessarily talking, with Ben or with anybody else directly. So I don't necessarily always have a foil for my thoughts. But anyway, I was going to put that one out there, see what people have as a thought. And obviously, if you have anything to talk about in conjunction with it, feel free to send a comment in, and we'll try to address it in a future episode. Talk to you later.
All right, Kirk, thank you very much. That's all we've got for now. Like I said in the intro, we've got more content coming, and I will be trying to get those episodes out to you over the next few weeks of July here. So that's all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.